Okay, is it actually live now?
Share my slides.
Says your...
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical issue with slides.
Okay, are you good to go? I think so. Okay, hello everyone. I'm so sorry we've had a lot of
Everyone, as you're joining me,
technical difficulties today. But if you're just joining again, my name is Ashley Hopkins Benton. I'm a senior historian and curator at the New York State Museum, and I'm so excited today to be in Claremont State Historic Site's virtual space to talk to you about the history of the women's suffrage movement in New York State, and specifically its ties to the Hudson Valley. In 1917, New York State passed women's suffrage, and so in 2017, the New York State Museum hosted an exhibit called Votes for Women, celebrating New York Suffrage Centennial in celebration of that event. And then last year was the 100th anniversary of the federal amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote on the federal level. So women began talking about women's rights relatively early. During the time of the formation of the country and the American Revolution, women were talking about women's rights. But those talks about women's rights all kind of coalesced in July of 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. This was a convention that was organized to specifically address the ways that women were discriminated against in a whole different bunch of different areas in their lives. And the convention talked about broad reforms, about the lack of access for women in the professions and education, discrimination that they faced in the church, and the need for dress reform. But this was not the first achievement that women had in the area of women's rights in New York State. So in a carryover from English law, when the laws in New York State were first set up, a woman's property passed from her father to her husband at the time of marriage, rendering women completely invisible in accordance with the law. And even money that she inherited went to her husband. If he was a drunk and he wasted it all and she couldn't take care of her children, she had no recourse. So in 1836, a petitioning campaign was started, led by Ernestine Rose, and you can see Rose here. Rose was born in Poland and came to the United States after traveling through various places in Europe. It's important to note that petitioning was a really important tool for women at this time, because it was a way for them to communicate with lawmakers before women actually had the right to vote. So Rose began this speaking campaign in 1836. She traveled all over New York State, and this is really significant because women, it was not considered okay for women to speak to mixed groups of both men and women. So she was really breaking a lot of rules at the time. But in April of 1848, the movement succeeded, and New York State passed the Married Women's Property Act, and you can see the document here from the New York State Archives documenting that passage. Rose and others felt that the work was not yet done and that the law could have really achieved much more. The desk that you see here belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a leader in the movement in New York State, but also at the federal level. Stanton herself was a Livingston descendant. She was a great-great-granddaughter of Robert the Nephew. Her mother, Margaret Chin Livingston, was the first cousin once removed of Margaret Beekman Livingston, of course a very powerful female figure in the Livingston family. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter was also named Margaret Livingston Stanton, to make that connection. One of the things that this desk really stands for, as we look back at the history of the women's suffrage movement, is the importance of writing as a tool for 19th century women's rights reformers. Writing was a way for these women to continue work for the cause while they were home caring for their families. For women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had 7 children, she could not be out on the speaking circuit all the time the way women like Susan B. Anthony could. So writing was really important for her to get her message and her words across. And Anthony herself recognized this importance. She would actually come to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home and watch her children so that she had that important time to write. Conventions were also a very important tool for women in the 19th century, and following the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, another was held almost immediately in Rochester. And after that, throughout the 19th century, there were many held across the state at the local, state, and national levels. These conventions were an opportunity for women and male allies to discuss and focus their positions and strategies. It gave them valuable exposure in the press, and they were a way to educate new recruits to the cause. In February of 1854, Stanton delivered an address to the Women's Rights Convention in Albany regarding women's position in the laws of New York State. Her writing moved the gathering so much that they adopted it as the convention's address to the New York State Legislature, accompanying a petition containing 6,000 signatures. Stanton herself was not allowed to address the legislature directly, as she later erroneously remarked that she did, but printed copies were made available to legislators and were run in the newspapers. Now, it should also be said that newspapers were a really important tool for women at this time. Certainly, they worked to get coverage in the mainstream papers, but there were also a lot of women-run newspapers focused on women's rights with both local and national influence that were published in New York State. These included The Lily, which was edited by Amelia Bloomer from 1849 to 1853, The Revolution, which was edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton from 1868 to 1870, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, edited by Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin from 1870 to 1876, and the National Citizen and Ballot Box, edited by Matilda Joslyn Gage from 1878 to 1881. All of these very important tools for women to get their message out. By the 1840s and 50s, there was a lot of talk about how women were dressing, popular dress for women at the time, and the ways that it limited them in their activities and their lifestyle. At the time, it was popular for women to wear floor-length skirts with many layers. It was a very heavy and cumbersome costume. Even male-run newspapers talked about how popular fashion for women was bad, as their skirts picked up garbage and dirt from the streets as they moved about. So there was a lot of talk about how to change this, what different ways this could be addressed. And Elizabeth Smith Miller, who was the daughter of abolitionist Gerrit Smith and the cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, herself began wearing a shorter skirt over top of loose pants. And she found this getup much easier for gardening, for going for walks, for doing active things. Later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton commented, "To see my cousin, with a lamp in one hand and a baby in the other, walk up the stairs with ease and grace, while with flowing robes I pulled myself up with difficulty, lamp and baby out of the question, readily convinced me that there was sore need of reform in women's dress, and I promptly donned similar attire." Soon after, this kind of dress was published in Amelia Bloomer's newspaper, The Lily, and there was a brief explosion in popularity of what became known as the Bloomer costume, this short dress with loose pants underneath. It's unclear exactly where the inspiration came from, where Elizabeth Smith Miller got the idea. Certainly there were other groups wearing similar outfits. Haudenosaunee women, who were her neighbors, were wearing shorter skirts. Women in the water cure movement who felt really strongly about physical activity and movement were wearing a similar outfit, and women in the Oneida community as well. So very briefly, these were extremely popular. The dress that you see here on the slide is an extant example from Cortland, and it's one of only 2 known extant examples in the country. So it was really exciting to get to see this all together in person when we held the exhibit at the museum. As much as the women in the women's rights movement liked wearing this outfit and they felt so much freedom from it, they dropped it pretty quickly. And as Susan B. Anthony wrote, "The attention of my audience was fixed upon my clothes instead of my words." Nevertheless, there were women who continued to work for dress reform, and the Hudson Valley itself was a hotbed for this movement. Here you see the masthead of the newspaper The Sibyl, a review of the tastes, errors, and fashions of society, which was published by Lydia Sayre Hasbrouck in Middletown, New York. This became the voice of the dress reform movement from 1856 to 1864. Lydia Sayre was offered publication of this newspaper by John Hasbrouck, who was the publisher of the Middletown Whig Press. He felt strongly in this cause as well. Ultimately, she would marry him, and she and other dress reformers continued their work through the 1870s, and they actually felt that the association of the bloomer costume with the women's rights reformers actually hurt their movement, that people were not really ready for all of these changes at once. Many women's rights reformers in the 19th century came out of the abolition movement. They had been actively involved in working for abolition. But this didn't stop discrimination against women of color in the women's rights movement. Black women saw the vital importance of suffrage and the double discrimination that they faced, and they joined the cause anyway, despite all of this discrimination in the movement itself. For women's rights reformers, one aspect of this was fear that if they included a lot of women of color, they would be tied up with the abolition movement, and this could hurt their cause. One woman who continued the fight, despite the diversity that she faced, was Sojourner Truth. Truth was born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree in Ulster County, New York, and she, quote, walked away by daylight with her infant daughter when her master failed to uphold a promise to free her. She also later sued for the freedom of her son, who was illegally sold into slavery in Alabama, making her the first black woman to successfully sue a white man. Truth experienced a religious conversion and became a preacher, at which point she changed her name, and she was known as a very powerful speaker, drawing on her firsthand experiences both as a former slave and as a woman, as well as her experience as a mother. In the history of women's suffrage, Matilda Joslyn Gage commented on one of her speaking appearances and saying, quote, at her first word there was a profound hush. She spoke in deep tones, which, though not loud, reached every ear in the house and away through the throng at the doors and windows. One of Truth's most famous speeches was offered at the 1851 Ohio Women's Rights Convention. And it's important to note that Truth herself did not learn to read or write, so what we know of her words comes through the accounts of others. And this speech, which became known as the Ain't I a Woman speech, was actually printed in the June 21st, 1851 issue of the Anti-Slavery Bugle, an Ohio newspaper, and also was later published in the Narrative of Sojourner Truth in 1875, and that later publishing was the one that she became really known for. However, the latter version uses a dialect stereotypical of a slave from the South, and we know that Truth's first language, which was Dutch, so that dialect that's published in the paper is likely inaccurate. However, her message comes through loud and clear, that women are equal with men, and African American women should not be ignored in the women's rights movement. Following the Civil War, during the Civil War, the women's rights reformers really set aside their cause and worked for the war effort. But following the Civil War, there was new hope for significant change, and many reformers believed it was possible to pass both African American male suffrage and women's suffrage at the national level. The American Equal Rights Association was formed to work for both causes together. In November of 1866, a universal suffrage convention was held at Tweddle Hall in Albany. And this meeting was a glimpse into the split that would soon occur both among reformers in the American Equal Rights Association and also among suffragists. Charles L. Redmond, a prominent orator and abolitionist who was also on the business committee of the convention, announced, quote, the time is come when we shall go to the ballot box with our wives and sisters as the late slaveholders shall with their emancipated blacks. So in that quote you see a little bit of the optimism of the time. The convention began with a resolution to form equal rights clubs across the state, which was, as we'll see soon, did indeed happen. There was a disagreement on qualifications for suffrage. Some people promoted the idea of an intelligent suffrage, where people should only be able to vote based on an education test. Others thoroughly dissented against this idea, including Frederick Douglass, who said he, quote, found great difficulty in applying any qualification to the right of suffrage beyond that of common humanity, manhood, womanhood. But as I mentioned, the roots of a greater schism really started to come out in this meeting over the priority of women's suffrage versus African American male suffrage. Reformers were starting to see that these two would not happen at the same time and began to argue about which should happen first. The 14th Amendment, proposed in June of 1866, 5 months prior to the convention, added the word male to the Constitution. This was the first gender-specific language proposed in any constitutional amendment. And this law launched a fierce debate over what citizenship actually meant and whether women were even citizens at all during these 2 years of ratification. At the Albany Convention, Douglass gave a speech in which he spoke of victory for African American male suffrage, quote, giving suffrage to everybody. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was deeply concerned with the statement, reminding him, accept women, Mr. Douglass, accept women. Douglass also worried that, quote, from the preponderance of women on this platform, that this will be a women's rights convention nearly, and that the Negro will only be lugged in incidentally. But I cannot give up the Negro. I can see the importance of enfranchising women, but with the Negro, I see that enfranchisement is a matter of life and death. And that sentiment would be later echoed by many other reformers, including calls by Horace Greeley that the post-Civil War period was, quote, the Negro's hour first, before women's suffrage should be considered. With the passage of the 14th Amendment in July of 1868, and discussions and the ultimate passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, suffragists lost the battle of achieving suffrage alongside African American men. Some supported the prioritization of African American male voting rights and hoped that women's suffrage would be the next step, while others continued to push for women's suffrage first and turned to increasingly racist rhetoric. There was a rift in the suffrage movement with two national suffrage organizations emerging. In May of 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed by New York leaders, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they focused their efforts on a federal amendment for women's suffrage. Meanwhile, in November of 1869, the American Women's Suffrage Association was formed chiefly by leaders from New England, and they decided to focus on a state-by-state strategy. They felt that if suffrage was passed in enough individual states, eventually the country would follow. The National Women's Suffrage Association, led by the New Yorkers, used the 1876 centennial anniversary of American independence from Britain as an opportunity to highlight their cause. At the Centennial Exposition Grounds in Philadelphia, they were denied prominent official space on the exposition grounds. They were granted some small space way off in the back, which they deemed not appropriate. So they rented rooms nearby as their summer headquarters. Matilda Joslyn Gage penned the Declaration of the Rights of Women of the United States, in it saying, quote, while the nation is buoyant with patriotism and all hearts are tuned to praise, it is with sorrow we come to strike the one discordant note on this 100th anniversary of our country's birth, that being that women did not have the right to vote. The National Women's Suffrage Association headquarters had an autograph book, which you see here, which is currently in the collection of the Onondaga Historical Association. And it includes women who came to visit. It also has pasted-in names from women across the country who could not be there in person. And it includes some Hudson Valley signatures, including Mrs. Jane Welton of Poughkeepsie and Robert C. Morris of Albany. By the end of the 19th century, there were changes in the suffrage movement and in the general tenor of the time. By 1869, women could vote in 4 western states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Utah. And in 1890, there was a merger of those two separate suffrage organizations, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, a bit of a mouthful. with Elizabeth Cady Stanton serving as president and Susan B. Anthony as vice president. This group was an umbrella organization for state and local organizations across the country, and it focused on state-level suffrage work, again, with the idea that if enough states passed suffrage, a federal amendment would follow. In New York State, the New York State Women's Suffrage Association had been founded in 1869, but by the beginning of the 20th century, there was an explosion of local suffrage clubs, political equality clubs, and other women's groups that were working for the cause. And these clubs were not just a place to work for suffrage, but it was also a space for women to gather, to learn new skills, including public speaking and organizing skills. And on the suffrage side of things, it was a way to get out information, to rally the troops during major campaigns as they would have in New York State in 1915 and 1917. Most of these clubs were not integrated. African American women ultimately created many of their own suffrage clubs and civil rights clubs across the state, including the Colored Women's Suffrage League in New Rochelle. There were some efforts to work jointly among clubs. For example, in Dutchess County, the Dutchess County Equal Suffrage League, led by Vassar College Professor Laura J. Wiley, worked to solicit members at the AME Metropolitan Church on Smith Street in Poughkeepsie in 1914. And we can see here a list of some of the clubs that were formed in the Hudson Valley. Several to be noted that were nearby to Claremont include the Dutchess County Equal Suffrage League, formed in 1911, the Kingston Political Equality Club, formed in 1912, the Livingston Political Equality Club, notably formed in 1886, quite early, and the Women's League for Civic Education in Poughkeepsie, formed in 1913. There was a shift at the turn of the 20th century to more public methods to gain support for the suffrage movement. American suffragists were aware of the British suffrage movement and its militant side, its very public, very direct action focus. In the United States, meetings started to move from private spaces and parlors to open-air meetings, parades, automobile tours, and hikes. In February of 1908, the first suffrage parade was held in New York City. Only 23 women attended, but that was followed by larger and larger parades, including very large ones ahead of both the 1915 and 1917 suffrage referendum votes. And one interesting note about the Hudson Valley at Vassar College is in 1908, a trolley car campaign was organized to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. And it took place across the state. Its last stop was in Poughkeepsie. At Vassar College, President James Monroe Taylor had prohibited suffrage meetings on campus. So to commemorate this last stop, Inez Mulholland, who was a student at Vassar at the time, led a meeting in the cemetery across the street where Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was also an alum of the college from 1878, the author Charlotte Perkins Gilman, lawyer Helen Hoy, and labor leader Rose Schneiderman were all speakers. And Inez went on to a really prominent role in the national suffrage movement, speaking across the country. And on the lower right of the slide, you can see her riding a parade at the head of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. At the New York State Museum, we have a really wonderful artifact that speaks to these public movements, and this is the Spirit of 1776 wagon. The wagon was made by the I.S. Remsen Manufacturing Company in Brooklyn and was donated to the New York State Suffrage Association by the manufacturing company. The suffragists believed that it was actually made in 1776. We know now that it was made closer to about 1840. But because they felt it was from the time of the American Revolution, the wagon carried signs that read slogans such as, "If taxation without representation was tyranny in 1776, why not in 1913?" The wagon was used as a speaker's platform and in parades on Long Island by Edna Kearns. And in the summer of 1913, Edna Kearns and Irene Davidson, both dressed as Minutemen, drove it to New York City, accompanied by Kearns's daughter Serena Kearns, who was dressed as Lady Liberty. So these connections between the American Revolution and the suffrage movement constantly appear throughout the women's rights movement. On December 16th of 1912, a suffrage hike, which began with 26 women, left the 242nd Street subway station in New York City and headed north to Albany in order to present a petition to Governor-elect Sulzer. This hike was planned by Rosalie Jones, who referred to herself as General. They took a very military look at the way they organized this hike. She was a radical suffragist from Oyster Bay, New York. There was a small group of women who went the whole way, including Ida Augusta Craft of Brooklyn, Lavinia Lloyd Dock, who was a trained nurse and settlement house worker, Sybil Wilbur from Boston, who was an investigative journalist, and Catherine Stiles of Brooklyn. The whole journey took 13 days, and they arrived at the New York State Capitol on December 28th. At the start, the marchers were given a knapsack so they could carry suffrage material, and further support, including their food supplies and luggage, were carried by automobile. The suffragist marchers were joined along the route by reporters and supporters, and they got a lot of newspaper publicity, which was really the whole point of this march. Thankfully, these newspaper reports give us a lot of insight into how the suffragists were received in various places and what it was like for them along the way. In an account to the Brooklyn Eagle by Rosalie Gardner Jones and Ida Craft, they talked about their march from Peekskill to Fishkill. Quote, "It was the day we walked from Peekskill to Fishkill, 22 miles, through 6-inch mud, with the cold rain beating in our faces. In the muddiest corner of a country road we met 2 men, evidently residents of the nearby farms. They gave us cheery greetings, and as they passed we heard one say, 'Gee whiz, Bill, they're doing more for their cause than we men would.'" The marchers spent Christmas Day in Hudson at the Worth Hotel, and a newspaper report from the New York Press on December 26 tells us, quote, "This afternoon the general gave a tea," that's Rosalie Jones they're talking about, "to her army and camp followers. There were a Christmas tree and gifts for each presented by Colonel Craft. The war correspondents made their gift, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, in which each marcher and each war correspondent had written his or her sentiments regarding the journey. Such useful gifts as cold cream, foot powder, foot soap, and water pails also decorated the tree. Early tomorrow the hikers will start for Stockport, where they will spend the night. The itinerary has been completed. On Friday night they will be at Schodack Center. The last night before reaching Albany will be spent in Rensselaer. Accompanying them from here tomorrow will be a delegation of Hudson suffragettes, prominent among them Mrs. Luella D. Smith, president of the local Women's Christian Temperance Union, Mrs. C.B. Snyder of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and prominent club women of the city, Sally Supplebean and Eloise Payne. The women, as I said, arrived in Albany. They delivered this hand-decorated petition, which was done by Rosalie Jones herself to Governor Sulzer, which was signed by a number of leaders in the suffrage movement, including Harriet May Mills, who was the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, and Nora Blatch DeForest, who was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and also the first woman admitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers. The march was so successful that they followed it up with another march organized by Rosalie Jones and Ida Craft from New York City to Washington, D.C. in February 1913, corresponding with President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It's important to note, though, that these hikes were not inclusive. Women of color were not allowed to join them. So again, you see this discrimination in the suffrage movement itself, even as they work for greater equality. Another change that happened in the 20th century was the merchandising of the movement. During the McKinley-Bryant presidential campaign, the use of celluloid political buttons exploded, and the suffragists used this to their cause. There was also a rise in mass production and innovations in printmaking, which allowed for a broad variety of different items, which you can see here. Suffrage shops opened up in large cities, including at the National American Women's Suffrage headquarters at 505 Fifth Avenue in New York City, where there was a suffrage store. And of course, in smaller communities across the country, women could order through mail order catalogs. All of this got their message out in people's everyday lives. On the upper left, you can see a hood ornament, which could be used on a car in suffrage parades, but perhaps in everyday life as well. On the lower right is a perpetual calendar that could be carried in a woman's purse. So again and again and again, they would see this idea of votes for women. These materials also raised money for the movement. One very important organizer in both New York State and at the national level was Harriet Stanton Blatch. And I should say, at this time, there was a continuation of debate over strategy. Should there be a state-by-state approach, or should the work be taken at the federal level? And New York State leaders came down on both sides of this debate, but they all agreed that New York State was very politically important. And Blatch was one of the women who really turned the tides politically in New York State. Blatch was the second daughter and sixth child of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and was born in Seneca Falls. As I mentioned, she was an 1878 graduate of Vassar College, and she had worked with her mother on the suffrage circuit before moving to England for 20 years. During her time in England, she worked with suffragettes and with other women's focused reform groups before returning to the United States in 1902. And upon her return, she commented, "The suffrage movement was in a rut in New York State at the beginning of the 20th century. Most of the ammunition was being wasted on its supporters in private dining rooms and in public halls." She felt that a change was needed. So she formed the Women's Political Union, inspired by the militant British movement. And you can see their pennant in the top portion of this slide. She adopted the colors of the British suffrage movement, the purple, white, and green. In 1910, the Women's Political Union led a campaign to get the New York State Legislature to pass a bill authorizing a referendum on women's suffrage. In New York State, amendments had to be passed by 2 consecutive legislatures before being placed on the ballot in the next general election. So she took up this cause. You can see in the image her and other reformers marching up the steps of the New York State Capitol. The Women's Political Union set up offices in Albany, they hired a lobbyist, and they even began publishing a newspaper devoted to the politics of suffrage called the Women's Political World. The marching photo is from March 12, 1912, when they were seeking to obtain signatures from a majority of the assemblymen in an effort to bring the suffrage measure to the assembly. By the end of 1912, the Women's Political Union had persuaded the 3 major political parties to adopt a suffrage plank, and on January 27, 1913, both houses of the state legislature signed legislation eliminating the word male and enfranchising every male citizen of 21 years. 1915 was a very important year in the suffrage movement, not just in New York State, but elsewhere in the Northeast. There were major suffrage referendum votes in New York State, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And I just wanted to share briefly with you this artifact, which is actually related to the Pennsylvania campaign, but has ties to the Hudson Valley. So what you see here is the casting of the Justice Bell, or the Suffrage Liberty Bell, which was commissioned by Pennsylvania suffragist Catherine Wentworth Rauschenberger. And it was cast at the Manili Bell Company in Troy, New York, a really famous casting company which produced many bells for churches and other organizations across the country. At its 1915 unveiling, there was a ceremony in Troy with prominent Pennsylvania suffragists dressed in white, as you can see in the image here. And the bell then toured Pennsylvania with its clapper chained down until the 19th Amendment was passed. And this bell lives today in the Washington Chapel at Valley Forge National Historic Site. So meanwhile, in New York State, the New York State Legislature approved the inclusion of the suffrage measure on the ballot in 1915. But of course, the important trick for suffragists was that they had to convince men to vote for it, because of course they did not have the right to vote. New York State was considered challenging. It was diverse in terms of both the fact that it had very large urban and rural areas, and 25% of the population was foreign-born. Not to mention there were very powerful political machines in the state that were against suffrage. Another major leader in New York State and at the national level was Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt actually grew up in Iowa and got her start as a teacher, as did many women in the suffrage organizations. And Susan B. Anthony noticed her organizing and her speaking skills at the local and state level and then recruited her for the national organization. Upon the death of her second husband, she traveled internationally for suffrage before settling in New York City. In November of 1913, she organized leaders from suffrage groups across the state into the Empire State Campaign Committee to work for the 1915 campaign. They had a really intense organizational structure with 12, the state divided into 12 campaign districts, each with a chairman, with assembly district leaders and district captains. So this was a really organized operation. The vote in 1915 took place on November 2nd, and it was a loss for the suffragists. They lost by 194,984 votes. However, they still took it as a win, as this was the largest vote ever tallied for women's suffrage, with 42% in favor. The suffragists picked right back up where they started. They got back to work, and they launched a new campaign. The Empire State Campaign Committee and the New York State Women's Suffrage Association consolidated under the New York State Women's Suffrage Party and worked together for this cause. And by this time, of course, the suffragists were veterans. They had already raised money, they knew how to file petitions, they knew how to canvass voters, and they continued to get out and give speeches, hold parades, and work across the state. There was also the fact that World War I had begun, and the women launched their support in the war effort, so this helped their cause as well. You can see here the flag of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party, and on the lower right, a still image taken from the American Experiences documentary, The Vote, where you can see this very flag being carried up State Street in Albany. On November 6, 1917, New York voters went back to the polls with the suffrage referendum again on the ballot, and this time the suffragists won. They won by 103,863 votes. And then the New York State suffragists shifted their focus to the national campaign, working for the 19th Amendment, which ultimately was ratified on August 18, 1920. And finally, I don't want to end the story there because, of course, suffragists realized as soon as the vote was passed that having suffrage did not guarantee equality, and there was an awful lot of work to be done still. New York women worked for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which still has not been passed. Women worked into getting into politics, important women like Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug from New York. And in our museum collections, we have a great representation from the 2017 Women's Marches. These were organized before the inauguration of Donald Trump. A major protest was held in Washington, D.C., where hundreds of thousands of women gathered, and sister marches were held around the world and in many places in the Hudson Valley, including Poughkeepsie, Hudson, Woodstock, New York City, and Albany. These protests focus on a broad swath of issues. Initially, there was a focus on Trump's vow to reduce women's reproductive rights and his documented misogynistic remarks, but other women's issues emerged very quickly, and if you looked at the signs from the protests, they included climate change, LGBTQ plus rights, Black Lives Matter, and immigrant rights, among many other issues. The New York State Museum collected materials from Albany, Poughkeepsie, Seneca Falls, and also from New York women who went to Washington, D.C. And here we can see two of the items that we collected from Walkway Over the Hudson at their sister march in Poughkeepsie, New York. On the left is a banner made and carried by Angela Panzer, Amanda Panzer, Eve Magdalenoita, and Elizabeth Silverstein. And then on the right is the G family carrying their poster, which is also in our collection. And as we collected these materials, one of the themes that emerged was the strength of young people in this movement and how many children were involved in the march. And just to bring things full circle, one of the the things that this brought out was the ties to the suffrage campaign. The fact that these women that were or these children that were at the Women's March were not old enough to vote, but they were using this march as a way to get their political voice heard. And that, of course, is a major struggle that the suffragists had as well. So that brings me to the end. You can see my contact information here. If you have any follow-up questions, I'll try to answer them in the comments on Facebook, but you're also welcome to email me. I'll also mention that the New York State Museum has a whole resource page for women's suffrage, which includes educational materials for teachers. So I encourage you to check that out. And also there is a catalog published by SUNY Press on this topic by the same name, Votes for Women Celebrating New York Suffrage Centennial. Also, we have a forthcoming article in Marist Hudson River Valley Review focused on this idea of women's suffrage through the lens of the Hudson Valley. And with that, I thank you all for attending, and as I said, I will take a peek back in the comments and see if there are any questions, but I thank you for being here today.